Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Good evening. All right. So it really is a privilege to be with you. It's actually a special honor to share the podium with Andy Kramer. Of course, it's an honor just to be doing what we ought to be doing at a university, which is on the one hand sharing with one another what we believe to be understandings we've come to about the natural world, and on the other hand also sharing questions that we haven't yet answered. And both those are important. I'd like to begin actually with a story about my youngest son Gabe when he was 3 years old. I was holding him in my arms one evening, walked outside the door, and I don't know how this moment happens, but for Gabe, it was the first moment that he really, in his life, that he seemed to have really noticed the sunset. And it was a spectacular sunset. The sky was ablaze. I'm holding him in my arms, and he looks at me, and his eyes are huge as saucers, and his lips are literally quivering. And he says, "Daddy, look, God painted the sky." And I had to tell him, "Gabe, that's stupid. God has nothing to do with it. This is just due to the differential scattering of light biased in the direction of shortwave emissions, exaggerated by the rise of atmospheric particulates generated by the Industrial Revolution." Of course, I didn't do that. I entered into Gabe's moment of awe, and I just said, "Yeah, Gabe, God really makes beautiful things." With the confidence that when Gabe got older and he learned the laws of optics, if he still had a faith in God, which is up to him, not me, he would simply see these natural laws as God's mode of artistry. And if he didn't have faith in God, he'd still appreciate the natural laws. So in one sense, that might be the take-home message of this evening, and let's go home. Except, for some reason, the notion of evolution doesn't seem to have been as amenable to such a simple solution. And that's why we're here. Now, one reason it hasn't been so amenable is because the chain of inference leading to the conclusions of evolution is longer and less obvious than the chain of inference leading to the conclusion that the sun causes sunsets. But the other reason is that, unlike the laws of optics, evolutionary theory just raises a lot of questions for religious belief, and those questions have endured now for over a century. And people in this audience may have a number of different questions. So some of those questions might relate to the age of the Earth or the identity and location of the first humans, but I want to suggest that the most profound questions, the most enduring and abiding questions, the questions that people wrestled with from the very launch of Darwin's theory, and by the way, not just religious people, but also people in the humanities, have to do with the origin and nature of humankind. And they're a kind of two different ways that these questions emerge. One set of questions is, how were humans made? Were they made by the direct supernatural action of God? Or if you're a theist, could humanity have been made by God creating a cosmos with natural laws out of which human beings emerged? That's one set of questions. But there's a second, I would say, even more profound question, which is not how they were made, but however human beings were made, what kind of beings are we? What kind of purposes are endowed in us, if there is a creator, by the Creator, however he did that? And by the way, these things interact, because your notion of how human beings came about informs our understanding of what kind of beings we are. So there is a sense, widely promoted, that you kind of have to take your pick. And I'll just share a couple of quotes with you. This one's from Carl Vogt, Darwin's champion in Germany. Darwin's theory turns the Creator without any hesitation out of doors. Thus, man is not a special creation produced in a different way and distinct from other animals, endowed with an individual soul and animated by the breath of God. More recently, James Rachels, in his book, Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism, says Darwinism undermines both the idea that man is made in the image of God and that the idea that man is a uniquely rational being. The idea of human dignity turns out, therefore, to be the moral effluvium of a discredited metaphysics. And so these aren't Christian paranoid comments about the entailments of evolution. These are the positive entailments of at least some advocates of evolution, which has made many in our culture think that you have to pick. You have to pick either the science of evolution or the notion that human beings do have dignity, and that maybe in some measure this dignity hinges on some properties that other animals or creatures have foreshadowings of but don't completely share. And I guess I'm here to argue that you don't have to make this choice, that the choice is a false dichotomy. And so I want quickly in my talk tonight to just share a couple of snapshots of scientific evidence for human evolution. Oh boy, how could you do this in a 15 to 20 minute talk? But I'm just going to share a couple of things that have made a difference to me. And then secondly, make some comments on faith implications. So these are snapshots, and Andy's going to go deeper into much of this. But I want to share one observation of the fossil record. And I'll start with, I want to look at cranial capacity, or a different measure of cranial capacity called encephalization quotient. And here's a graph from a recent book of the encephalization quotients of Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens. This book is entitled Who Was Adam by Foz Reyna and Hugh Ross. I should say, by the way, that Foz and Hugh are personal friends of mine. And I love these guys. I laugh hard in their presence. We respect one another. We're all three shared. We're Christians. We're shared to the claims of the gospel, and we disagree with each other. So what they point out is that there's this large gap between the encephalization quotient of Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. And these are averages of encephalization quotients over time. And actually, this graph is correct, except that this is one average extended over time. If you look at the actual data throughout time, you get this. Homo erectus, cranial capacity goes up over time. Now, this is just 4 species. Andy has described himself as a lumper rather than a splitter, but if you throw in some other species, at least what some people think are other species, you get even a more impressive series of intermediates. And if you throw in raw data, this is what you get. I actually, as a biologist, it's hard to imagine a more impressive and complete sequence of anatomical intermediates than what you get when you look at the hominin cranial data. Now, this still leaves open, this is just an observation. It's an observation that we can't disagree with, but there's still the interpretation. An anatomical intermediate is an observation, and what led to something, whether something in fact is an evolutionary transitional form, well, that's an interpretation. And in human evolution, people have different interpretations. We have to be honest about that. So here are a couple of different proposals for these. This is dated by Don Johanson and the Leakeys. And you notice that Don Johanson's Australopithecus afarensis is in the line leading to Homo sapiens. He discovered this. Oops, it's not in the line leading to Homo sapiens by the Leakeys. Homo habilis is. They discovered that. So that's interpretation. Are we mired in interpretation then, that we have no understanding of whether these anatomical intermediates are transitional forms? Well, that's my second quick observation. If we want to make inferences about genealogy or family tree, let's go to genetics. Same route, genealogy and genetics. The genetic data are really impressive here. For many, many years, we had to make estimates of genetic similarities based on sampling protein sequences, but we've actually looked at the genomes. We've sequenced the genomes not only of human beings, but of chimpanzees, more recently orangs, more recently still gorillas. And what we see when we look at the comparative genomes, of the great apes is exactly what we would have predicted from an evolutionary phylogeny. Humans are closer to chimps than they are to gorillas than they are to orangs. Now you might say, well, that doesn't prove shared phylogeny because humans are similar to chimps. Of course we'd have similar DNA. So here's the next and last observation, and I have to say this is one that's just really struck me hard. What if we look at the similarity of degraded or non-functional genetic text? Now, I have to be clear, by here I'm not talking about this huge domain called junk DNA, DNA that for many years we didn't know the function of, we didn't think it had a function, now it looks like much of it might have function. No, I'm talking about particular genes that we know do have a function. And we see its very specific function in many, many species. But in some species, we can identify mutations which disrupt the gene and it doesn't do anything anymore. That's called a pseudogene. So an example of this would be vitamin C. Oh gosh, I'm not sure this is coming out well, but it turns out there are 3 genes that are necessary to make the protein vitamin C. And in most primates, we don't have this last gene. Actually, we have it, but it's broken. So we don't make vitamin C. That means you need to eat fruit or you get scurvy. Now, in an organism that has this gene, this is the gulo gene in a rat, it actually turns out that it's almost identical to primates that have the gene, but it's broken, except there's a deletion here. So we have pseudogenes that are virtually identical in primates, except for one deletion. Now, it turns out in other places of the gene, there are a few other changes. And here's what's really the cool thing. If we look at the changes in this pseudogene, what we get is humans and chimps are closest, orangs, macaques, as you go across the primates, get progressively less and less dissimilar. So the bottom line here is you can't say the genes are similar because they have similar functions. This gene has no function. It's broken, and it's broken in a way that is more and more similar the closer to the imputed human phylogenetic sequence we get. Now you might say, okay, that's one gene. Well, it turns out there are lots of pseudogenes. So there are olfactory pseudogenes. You get the same pattern in olfactory pseudogenes. I am going to allude to one last observation that I'm not going to talk about, but perhaps you can ask questions in the question session if you're interested. And this has less to do with genetic similarity of genes as it does with how genes are packaged in chromosomes, which biologists call karyotypes. And the karyotypes between humans and great apes are remarkable, including evidence, recently discovered evidence for an actual fusion between other great apes and human beings, which kind of, I have to say for me personally, was like the golden spike in persuading me of the unassailability of the conclusion that humans share ancestry with other primates. So now, what are the entailments of that? How would a Christian live with those conclusions? And for that matter, not just Christians, but anyone committed to the idea that there's some aspect of human dignity that emerges from human uniqueness. By the way, these are really complicated questions. Again, I'm giving you snapshots to launch discussion, but I want to make 2 points. The first point involves the question of providence in human origins. So this has been a question at least for several generations. George Gaylord Simpson, one of the architects of the modern theory, synthetic theory of evolution, says man is the result of a purposeless natural process that did not have him in mind. He was not planned. Steve Gould, evolutionary biologist from Harvard, who died a few years ago, said, "We are a momentary cosmic accident that would never arise again if the tree of life could be planted." He goes on later to say that although Gould was a great advocate of what he called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria, that science and religion did conflict, he did go on to say on this particular point that if you understood evolution, you couldn't accept the idea that human beings were a planned or providential outcome of a divine plan. And why would somebody claim that? There are a couple of reasons for this. One of them is the notion that contingency drives evolutionary change. so that if you played the tape of evolution over again, you'd never get the same thing. And the second related claim is that there's no deep directionality. There's no thematic coherence, much less progression to evolutionary history. And to comment quickly, the first claim in Gould's view, the example he used was the rise of mammals that came about 65 million years ago, imputed by some to the giant meteor that struck the Earth and caused a mass extinction. By the way, there's some really cool evidence for this. We found a crater dated about 65 million years off the Yucatan Peninsula. We have a layer of clay dated at exactly the right place, and actually the iridium content of this layer corresponds to what we would expect from a giant meteorite collision. The problem with this notion that this giant KT extinction drove the rise of mammals, and Andy may have something to say about this as well, is that the actual beginning of the rise of mammals occurred about 35 million years before this event. And if you look at the there's the event. And if you look at the slope of this curve, it doesn't change after the event either. So this raises the question, is there something else at work here? Is there an internal logic, dynamic, or structuring constraint on evolutionary development that makes the rise of certain kinds of creatures likely, if not inevitable? By the way, there's a big debate in evolutionary theory right now, but it's a debate that I would like to see on the table rather than off the table. So advocates of this would say yes. If I were giving this talk 20 years ago, this would be close to heresy in evolutionary theory. But there are a number of people arguing now that there's a series of major evolutionary transitions that are thematically coherent and then involve the increase of what's called cooperative interdependence at different levels of biological scale. For example, prokaryotic, simple cells to eukaryotic cells, unicellularity to multicellularity, asexual to sexual reproduction, solitary to eusocial, living together organisms, and primate to human sociality, all examples of posited major evolutionary transitions. And part of human sociology is the use of symbols, by the way, and ritual processes. And beyond that, if we dive more deeply into it, let's just take one aspect, the aspect of parental care, moving from organisms that exhibit no parental care to some parental care in hundreds, if not thousands of offspring, to greater care in fewer offspring, to the time we get to mammals, progressively greater care, and across human mammalian phylogeny, greater care for a longer period of time in a smaller number. So this is my son Gabe again, with my parents. Human beings are one of the few creatures that have grandparent care. Now, I'm going to make both a scientific and a personal comment here. I actually do believe that there is a thematic continuity to evolutionary history. And I believe that it involves the emergence of creatures capable of love. Now, I don't want to be saccharine here, because that very capability is also attended by tremendously enhanced capabilities for pain, including the pain of social loss, and attended by capacities for social betrayal, or what we might call evil. So this isn't a saccharine story, but it is a profound drama that occurs over evolutionary history. So lastly, if we view human beings as an extension of a process that's going somewhere, what do we make of human uniqueness? I have to acknowledge, first of all, that the very question of what it means to be unique is scientifically and a philosophically really difficult one. What it can't mean, or what it doesn't mean, even in Christian theology, is that we don't share continuity, we don't share substantival continuity with other creatures. I mean, even going back to Genesis, we're made out of dust. We're not made out of special kinds of stuff, even in the biblical view. And in the scientific view as well. But the question remains, is there any merit for thinking that human beings are unique in some ways? And some of my colleagues think not. So the primatologist Franz de Waal, with whom I've had the privilege of having these kinds of conversations before, says that it's a rare claim of human uniqueness that holds up for more than a decade. We have no basic wants or needs that cannot also be observed in our close relatives. Goes on to say, like us, they strive for power, enjoy sex, want security and protection, kill over territory. We seem to be reaching a point at which science can wrest morality from the hands of philosophers. I've extracted a couple of comments from different places that Franz has written. And this is a striking statement that was made in Nature, one of the leading scientific journals in the world a few years ago. With all deference to the sensibility of religious believers, the idea that man was created in the image of God can surely be laid aside. Well, two comments on this. First of all, it's not clear to me how, on the merits of any scientific understanding, one could make a theological conclusion about whether human beings were made in the image of God. So let's set that aside. I think what they might have meant was that on the merits of science, we can set aside the notion of human exceptionalism, that there's something different about us. Theological question set aside, human uniqueness question on the table. And I'll close with a couple of observations. I want to apologize for the fact that these are literally conversation starters and not conversation stoppers. But I just want to propose with some proposals from my colleagues, none of them Christian theists, for ways in which humans may be unique. And one of them has to do with ways in which we might be biologically unique. One proposal is the scale of human cooperation, both in terms of intensivity, how much we give or sacrifice or invest in others, and also extensivity, the size of human groups, is discontiguous with that seen in other species. So an article a while back from the Proceedings of the Royal Society says human cooperation exceeds that of all other species with regard to the scale and range of cooperative activities. And most importantly, we can discuss this in discussion, the adaptations that enable this scale of cooperation, which include language, naming, and human reputation, aren't seen in other species. E.O. Wilson, a Harvard biologist, has famously said, man has achieved an extraordinary degree of cooperation, and exactly how he alone has been able to cross this pinnacle is the culminating mystery of all biology. By the way, he didn't mean by that it's supernaturally explained. He just means that it's extraordinary and not yet fully explained. Secondly, some people suggest that morality itself is exceptional or unique to human beings. So I want to be honest, there's really great evidence to suggest the substrates of morality are shared with other creatures. So here's a really cool video of work done by the primatologist I measured, Franz de Waal, in which two capuchin monkeys are given rewards. Their favorite reward is a grape. They'll settle for a cucumber. And here we go. Listen to the video. Oops.
Grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us. That's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
So that's so cool. And look, Franz has masterfully demonstrated empirically that there's some, it appears to be some sense of fairness, even in other primates. Now the question is, and that certainly must underlie morality, the question is that the same as or sufficient for morality? And there's a big debate in the literature right now, but Jerome Kagan, developmental biologist at Harvard, says no. He says the continual desire to regard the self as good, not to be fairly treated, but to regard myself as being fair, is a unique feature of Homo sapiens, and although it has a firm foundation in the human genome, it's not an obvious derivative of the competence of apes and monkeys. Our biologically prepared biases render the human experience incommensurate with that of other species. And what he means by that is, and he may or may not be right on this, but he says humans experience guilt. And guilt, it turns out to be a really complicated phenomenon. It involves, first of all, my remembering my past actions, then my being able cognitively to entertain a counterfactual, that I can imagine an action that I could have chosen but didn't, then evaluating my action in light of a moral norm, and then in light of that evaluation, regretting the choice that I did make. Kagan says he thinks that's unique to human beings and it makes us exceptional. I have to say, I think he's probably true. But the most personal thing I'll share in my talk is that I suspect in an audience this large, we've all experienced guilt. And at a particular phase of my life, my sense that my life was not going a direction that I wanted it to go and that I was proud of it going, drove me to move from a sense of guilt to ask the question, is there an alternative? So the claim of the Christian gospel is that failure can not only be forgiven, but that God, in forgiving, can also empower change. Now, I happen to believe that's true, but more relevant to the point of this talk, that move seems to be, that capacity seems to be really unusual, uniquely human. It's hard to imagine other organisms, but we don't know the interior life of organisms, not only having guilt, but having this solution to guilt. And one of the things that I'm most interested in right now is evolutionary and cognitive accounts of religious cognition. So I'll just close with this observation. Those comments I just made have to do with human biological uniqueness. In other words, we're different, but presumably these capacities can be explained biologically in terms of ultimately the action of genes. So some biologists are arguing not only for biological uniqueness, but biological transcendence, that actually there are aspects of us and our behavior and our capacities that are informed by, for sure, but not reduced to or fully constrained by our genes. And again, this isn't a supernatural claim, could be, but it could be a claim involving emergence or other natural processes that are not reductive in nature. And two examples, and I'll shut up. One involves the symbolic representation and the extrasomatic storage of information. That just means storing information in forms of culture that don't reside in our genes. That has to be pretty recent, I would think. Interestingly, Dan Dennett, in his book Breaking the Spell, which is a pretty anti-religious argument, acknowledges that we have built-in desires to reproduce and do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal. In other words, we're just like every other creature. But we also have creeds. We have the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact makes us different, according to Dennett. And then last, we have the observation of what biologists call altruistic behavior. The capacity to exhibit a form of cooperation that helps others at net cost to our own fitness. Now, there's actually a debate on the extent to which this really exists in human beings. But Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous atheist in the world right now, concludes that we have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth. We can even discuss cultivating and nurturing a pure, disinterested altruism, something that has no place in nature, something that never existed before in the whole history of the world. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. As a Christian, by the way, I actually think Dawkins goes too far in this assertion of human uniqueness, kind of taking us out of nature, but only putting on the table the discussion of uniqueness. And I'll close with this quote from Pascal. The God of Christians is not a God who is simply the author of mathematical truths or the order of the elements. He is not merely a God who exercises his providence. The God of Christians is a God of love and of comfort, who fills the soul and heart of those whom he possesses, who makes them conscious of their inward wretchedness and his infinite mercy, and unites himself in their inmost soul, who fills it with humility and joy, with confidence and love, and who renders them incapable of any other end than himself. Pascal's saying the God of Christians is not a God that we reason to by scientific or mathematical proofs, but who approaches us and meets our deepest human needs. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm really eager to hear my colleague, Andy.
Well, I'd like to thank Jeff for a wonderful lead-in and beginning of our evening together. I also want to thank Veritas for inviting me and arranging this evening. And what I'm going to be doing for the next 15 to 20 minutes, check that, 10 to 15 minutes, we'll be talking about my perspective from a paleoanthropologist's lifelong pursuit of trying to understand how and where we came from in the context of human evolution. And what I'm going to be doing this, as I said, is from a personal perspective. And I'm going to be taking you on a quick 4.5 million year journey over these next 15 minutes to getting to our most immediate predecessor. And I'll leave you in a little suspense about where we're going to end up. But as this is reflecting the theme of our evening together, this question of whether or not Neanderthals believed, and what does that say about us, and what does that say about human uniqueness. And I think Jeff beautifully discussed those qualities that he sees as unique amongst humans. And I might be presenting a bit of a different take on it. So, if we go back far enough, we have earliest ancestors that, at this point, date somewhere between 4 to 6, maybe even 7 million years ago. The most recent of these that has been getting a lot of press has been Artie. And Artie, in 2009, made the cover of Science. Big issue that was received a lot of worldwide press. And Australopithecus ramidus, as illustrated in this couple of reconstructions, was discovered initially in the 1990s, in fact, 1994, in Aramis, Ethiopia, and it dates to 4.4 million years ago. And what I want to do with these illustrations and these depictions of our presumed ancestors is talk about how we are going to go through time and see a quite significant change. But, as Jeff alluded to earlier, we're going to see what I perceive to be more continuity than discontinuity in the context of how we've got from something that looks like this to something that is much more recognizably us. So as you can see with this reconstruction of Artie, you'll automatically notice those really long arms, and perhaps most of you would notice something that none of you are sporting inside your shoes, and that's that splayed-off big toe. Pretty unique feature that, in fact, is not present in any later hominids. As I mentioned, this dates to about 4.4 million years old, pretty close to the expected age of the last common ancestor that we humans share with our closest living relative, and that's the chimpanzee. It's been presumed that we split from the chimpanzee, the common ancestor we share with the chimpanzees, somewhere between 4 and 6 million years ago. Artie, Australopithecus ramidus, may be a representative pretty close to that common ancestry. To be honest, I'm not convinced that Artie is on our side of that split. I actually think that this divergent big toe and other aspects of its morphology and its association with the fossils and environments in which it was found might suggest it wasn't still, in fact, on the ape side of that split. Nevertheless, we have this specimen, and as is with most science, this is not a settled issue at all. And in fact, the researchers that presented this suggest that, in fact, this is the earliest ancestor of ours that we have evidence of at this point. As we move a little bit farther into the evolutionary story, Australopithecus afarensis is depicted here, most famously, of course, represented by Lucy, right here. And Lucy was discovered in 1974 in Hadar, Ethiopia. She dates to 3.2 million years ago. So we're now about another million plus years ahead of where we were in the previous slide with Australopithecus. And what I really enjoy is this depiction by J. Maternus of a wandering Australopithecine band through the forests in East Africa. And the jarring nature of what this picture looks like to most of us. If you look from the necks down, it looks pretty human. We're talking about a group of ancestors that are recognizably walking very similarly to us, may be a little bit different in the context of furriness and of overall body size differences between males and females, which were approaching gorilla levels of what's called sexual dimorphism, of the size difference between males and females. But then if you look at the skulls and the faces, you see something that's quite ape-like. And that, in fact, is something that we see in these earlier hominids, that this juxtaposition of a very human-like postcranium, in other words, the body below the skull, with that very ape-like skull and face associated with it, is something that we don't see anywhere on the world today. And this really interesting sort of transition of an ape-like ancestral form from the neck up to a more human-like form from the neck down is something that is really compelling for most paleoanthropologists to suggest that, yes, it is interpretation, as Jeff said, but the most likely interpretation that we come to is that this, in fact, was something that's bridging the gap between an ape-like ancestor and more human-like descendants. So here we are, 3.2 million years ago in East Africa. But nevertheless, despite the fact that they're walking upright like we are, in most every other situation, in most every other context of their existence, these hominids were most likely behaving much more like what we would perceive as an ape. And in fact, many people refer to these as bipedal apes. As you can see, we still have them climbing trees, and their arms are relatively long. And as a result of this, we see that this ape-like characteristic of these hominids was very, very plain and obvious at this point in our evolution. In addition, the brain inside that skull is quite small. As Jeff was showing earlier in the context of brain size evolution, these brains are about the third of the size of ours. And it's not until quite a bit later that we start to see significant brain size increase in our evolution and the important implications and adaptations that that takes with it. So as we move on from afarensis, we get next in these large stages of human evolution. And I don't want to misrepresent our understanding of human evolution. It's not this simplistic, it's not linear. But right now what I'm presenting to you is, in the interest of time, the major stages of human evolution as represented by these different time slices. At this point, we're about 2 million years ago. And this is represented by a specimen, most famously, this is K&M ER 1470, a skull from northwest Kenya that was also discovered in the 1970s. And what's significant about this skull is that this brain that is encompassed by that cranium is a good 50% bigger than just about any other Australopithecine skull that had been discovered before. So now we're talking about an increase in brain size. And we're also seeing a concomitant increase in behavioral complexity, as evidenced by this depiction of a slice of life of Homo habilis by the lakeshore of Turkana. And we see evidence in the archaeological record of stone tools and the possibilities, the likelihood that we're starting to see more of a reliance upon culture that had not previously been seen before. And Homo habilis is an interesting species in the context of how is it interpreted. Today, there is now a large percentage of human evolutionary scientists that think that Homo habilis is, in fact, multiple species. That a number of species may have been coexistent at this time in this area. Some, in fact, may not have even been our own genus, Homo, but instead were Australopithecus. Nevertheless, by 500,000 years later, we have Homo erectus on the scene. And represented by perhaps the most spectacular hominid fossil ever discovered, most complete hominid fossil discovered before humans started burying their dead, and this is known as the Turkana Boy right here. He was discovered in 1984 on the west side of Lake Turkana. Dates to about 1.52 million years ago. And he is quite a bit different from what we've been talking about up to this point, in that he is much more like us. He was about 5'5" tall when he died, but he died when he was not fully grown. He probably would have reached 6 feet tall as an adult. which suggests that by the time we're talking about here, 1.5 million years ago, humans were already in the modern range of human height. And more significantly, we're seeing this species as very likely the first to become widespread around the world. The old world is what I'm referring to here. Africa, getting out of Africa for the first time into Eurasia. And controlling fire, there's evidence of perhaps use of fire by hominids as early as 1.6 million years ago. And the ability to spread around the world, in large part, I think, once again, is being driven by an increase in brain size, as we saw in Dr. Schloss's presentation earlier. And the brain size increase is, I think, key in helping us to understand where we are today. Because the brain is our, of course, overriding organ that can help us understand the abilities that we have, and that has allowed us to gather in these large congregations and make sense of our past. Brain probably increased in size. I think there's 3 major reasons for this that include the reliance upon a technology, a stone tool technology, that became increasingly more sophisticated over time. In addition, the ability to start to harvest animal protein for food. In fact, hunting was probably coming into the fore at this point. And I think most importantly, the feedback loop that was initiated by having social animals in the first place, becoming even more social and having the complexity of social roles, really was the key in, I think, the developing brain. And at this point, we have brains that are about 2/3 the size of ours, at about 1,000 cc's. So as we move forward from Homo erectus, we get to the Neanderthals. And in between Homo erectus and Neanderthals, there are a number of other populations. In fact, some anthropologists refer to them as different species. I'm of the mind that at this point, we're not going to be identifying these as different species. But at this point, Neanderthals are the first to become fully adapted to the glacial climates of Europe, as depicted in this slide here. And this was, in fact, I was able to get this from NASA. They're presumably looking at Mars. Mars didn't look that big back then. It doesn't look that big right now either. But nevertheless, that was what this was illustrating. But here we have this Neanderthal clan. And in many respects, what we see over the years since the Neanderthals were first discovered and recognized as such back in the 1850s, that Neanderthals have become more human over time. It's never been a good thing to call anybody a Neanderthal. It's never been a compliment. It's always been a rather unfortunate thing to be called, particularly if you ever called that in the media. You know you've done something really, really crude and bad. But nevertheless, today their reputation is becoming much more rehabilitated. And in fact, they're becoming as human as we are. And some of these newer discoveries in that context happen to involve what now is representing the earliest cave art that we have evidence of in Europe. And previous to this discovery, this is from a cave site in southern Spain called Neanderthal, dates to between 42 and 43,000 years ago. And this is a good 10,000 years before we have early modern humans in Western Europe. You might think at first blush, when you take a look at this, that perhaps this Neanderthal artist got the jump on Watson and Crick by about 40,000 years. But no, this is probably not a depiction of the DNA double helical molecule by an early, very advanced scientific Neanderthal. Instead, what the scientists think that these are depictions of are seals that were probably important prey items along the coast in these coastal caves in southern Spain. And of course, coming to the point of our discussion this evening, Neanderthals were so human that we imbue them with the possibility interpreting their behavior as religious. They're the first to bury their dead in the archaeological record. And they buried their dead, as a colleague of mine has said, in many loving ways. And here's a depiction of one of those burials at the site of Shanadar in the Zagros Mountains of Iraq, in which we find evidence of flowers with these dead, with in particular one individual in this cave site in Iraq. And the inclusion of burial goods, not just flowers in Iraq, but also beautiful stone points in France and elsewhere, suggest this dawning religious awareness in these earlier humans. And so what I've tried to illustrate with this brief foray over the last 4.5 million years of our evolution is a transition from a very ape-like depiction, a very ape-like existence of our earliest ancestors, through what I hope to was illustrated, a more continual development towards a more human-like characteristic over time. And the point that I'm ultimately trying to make is that Neanderthals are as human as we are, and even though many consider them to be a different species, I don't agree with that. As you can see, earlier I referred to them as Neanderthal, as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, as a subspecies of our own. The point is this idea of human uniqueness is, I think, unnecessary. And I think that we have reached our levels of distinction from what we perceive as the animal world more as a indication of quantity, not of kind, and that the commonalities that we share with the animal kingdom are something that I think we need to celebrate, and that I think we can understand from a naturalistic perspective without having to resort to imbuing anything supernaturally endowed in us to understand what we are today. And I think that might perhaps help us lead into our discussion in the next portion of this event tonight. So, looking forward to having a conversation now with Jeff. Thank you.
So thank you, Jeff and Andy, for two very interesting perspectives on how to bring us into the conversation tonight. I thought that perhaps one place to start to get the ball rolling would be to think a little bit about definition of terms. We've used the word uniqueness a lot tonight, but getting a better understanding of what that means scientifically might help. So, for instance, when you talk about human uniqueness, we've talked about that being a difference in degree or a difference in kind. But even Darwin, Huxley, and Wallace disagreed on what that word meant and how we talk about it. So within your own specialties, what does that distinction even mean? And how do you see that applying in this case?
I think that from my perspective in paleoanthropology in particular, now I don't speak for all paleoanthropologists. I know one of my esteemed colleagues, Ian Tattersall, certainly thinks that we are a unique species. However, as I just stated, I don't think we are. Or I don't think that uniqueness, let me put it this way, is a productive way of trying to help us to understand what we are. Uniqueness is another way of almost saying a singularity, in that this is something that cannot be explained through comparisons to others, because by the very definition of being unique, there are no others that are like this. And so I think what it seems to almost do is to stop inquiry, to sort of, in its tracks, say, all right, well, we're unique, that's cool, let's describe how different we are, we can define that, and then that's it. So I think one of the issues that I have with this, the issue of referring to us as unique, is that I think in some respects it dampens further exploration into what may have caused, what the underlying adaptations, the underlying laws, rules may have produced what we are perceiving as this uniqueness.
Okay, so in a sense it's almost a scientific non-starter.
Yeah, I see it that way.
Jeff, how would you think about the concept?
Well, I think the concept has been used in so many different ways that the kind of conversation we're having right now is really helpful to, first of all, acknowledge that people don't even agree on what it means to say that something is unique. I mean, for some people, unique simply means ontologically set apart. Philosophers use the term natural kinds. So if you think of a term of natural kind, then every kind is unique. If species are natural kinds, then every species is unique. And one species isn't any more unique than another species. Or if you think of particular properties, the largest animal on Earth is unique by virtue of being the largest, and the smallest is unique by virtue of being the smallest. But I agree with Andy, there's no sense of singularity there. So that's one sense of being unique, that you should simply identify things as discernible kinds, and once you have a kind, it's not like other kinds, although it may share properties with them. But there's another sense of being unique, and that's the sense that I was exploring in my talk. And it's not so much that something is a singularity. So actually, there's nothing in Andy's talk this evening that I would disagree with. This series of intermediates that lead up to human beings, including Homo neanderthalensis or Homo sapiens variety neanderthalensis, this expanding suite of cognitive and social and behavioral competencies, including the capacity for art. I mean, it's there. We can't get rid of it, but I guess I'd want to ask two questions. First of all, one thing that uniqueness might mean is this series still there? And the answer is no. What Andy showed on the slides are all beings that no longer exist. And while there is a continuum leading up to human beings in this phylogenetic sequence, those beings aren't here anymore. So what I'm not suggesting is that there's something supernatural or that there's a non-material soul. There actually might be, but it doesn't require that. It's just that the series of intermediates are no longer here. And in terms of what we now have, do human beings have properties that are substantively different than the properties that we see in other organisms? And it would be the same thing as saying, imagine, for example, a series of intermediates in evolution that led from the colonization to land by water-dwelling organisms. Nothing's unique there. There's this wonderful series. But now imagine that the series is gone. Over history, the transitional forms are gone, and that for some reason all the manifold land-dwelling organisms are all extinct but one. Now, are we going to call that unique? Are we going to call one and only one species in the entire world that inhabits land, and every other species inhabits aquatic environments unique? And I guess I'd want to say not on metaphysical or theological grounds, but just on biological grounds, I'd want to say it's unique. Not because there's no continuum, not because it's a singularity in terms of processes, but because it's really different and nobody else is like it. And this is a conversation, sorry for going on too long, but I would want to say just one other thing. And one other way of asking the question of uniqueness is the following. Do the same, not in terms of properties, but in terms of the explanations of the properties. Are processes at work in one or several species that we don't see in others? And by that I don't mean supernatural, but I vote yes for human beings, and I'll give you one example. The scale of human sociality, in terms of cooperating with non-genetically related conspecifics, I don't know a biologist who doesn't agree that it exceeds the scale found in other organisms. Is it discontinuous? Do we need magic? No. But are there processes at work that we don't see in other organisms? And one of the prevailing theories is that human beings are able to cooperate at scales beyond those with whom we've had previous cooperative interaction because of what's called indirect reciprocity. Because humans transmit reputations about other humans, so that I can cooperate with somebody I haven't met because I've heard from a third party that it's okay to cooperate with them. Is there evidence that that goes on in other species? Reputationally mediated indirect reciprocity? No, there isn't. It takes language, for one thing. I think that's unique. I don't think it's supernatural. But I don't think there's anything, and I think it is the culmination of an evolutionary process, and it makes perfectly good sense from the standpoint of natural selection. So it's not magic, but we don't find it.
And I agree. I would think that if we're defining unique as these types of phenomena that don't exist, as best we can tell, in any other organisms on the planet, then yeah, I suppose we could refer to that as unique. But again, I think the point that I think is salient in your discussion was the fact that there's no break, that in fact it seems to be some manifestation of scale, and that the underlying possibilities were there in perhaps predecessors or in other closely related organisms that are social. And it may be just a function of the large populations that we live in, as well as, of course, as I would contend, the most important organ, and that's the brain of our species, that allows for these kinds of remarkably complex social relationships to exist. So I think that we can still try to understand these things in the context of comparison with other organisms, perhaps that are closely related, or that are very, very living in huge social situations, and maybe find commonalities there that can help us understand these sort of emergent properties of human sociality that don't seem to have very easy comparators in the natural world.
This notion of there being no break is a difficult one, and even my colleagues in biology, with no theological agenda, disagree on this. So some people think that there's a profound break, not in terms of there being supernatural forces at work, but in terms of, well, Terence Deacon, for example, has a chapter in a book called The Symbolic Species that he entitles "The Word Becomes Flesh." He's not a Christian, he's not a theist as far as I know, but he argues that there's a break insofar as that human beings have the capacity to transmit cultural information, and that this cultural information is embodied in us in a way that enables us to do things, not only that we couldn't do by genes alone, like go to the moon or build bridges or do calculations for engineering, but it actually enables us to do things that oppose the dispositions that are natively there by a genetic endowment. That's a big debate in biology. Richard Dawkins, who I quoted at the end, signs up for this, that we alone on Earth can rebel against the selfish replicators. Dawkins, I actually don't think has a coherent proposal for how that would occur. But yeah, I'll just put on the table that biologists themselves are debating these issues these days, and it's a fascinating, and this university and this conversation is a great place to have the conversation.
Okay, well, we're talking about the idea of that consistent consistent trajectory. If you could, in fact, agree on if you can prove something makes something unique, is there a point where using your different disciplines that you can even point to a spot where you can say humans are unique? That from this point forward, what we have here is a human being, and from this point back, we have something that's not human, but it's unique and interesting or different in its own way. Is it possible, using your disciplines, to find that point, or do you have to take the idea of this continuous trajectory?
That's a really interesting question, I think, and it's one that I've wrestled with over the years as well, and how to present our evolutionary history in the context of when did we become human.
Right.
And for me, I've come to a satisfactory answer to that. But again, it has a lot to do with how one defines your terms. You know, right. What is human? What is unique? What is animal? What is not? Mm-hmm. And I think some of those dichotomies are not very useful. In the context of saying we're not animals, I think it gives humans a lot of leeway to do really bad things on this planet to other things that are not us. And as we can see, we do a lot of bad things to things that are us. But nevertheless, the idea of when we became human, I sort of alluded to that in my quick little 4.5 million year, 15-minute presentation, that when we get to be Homo erectus, we're in a body that's very much like ours. And I think that's very important. So this embodied aspect of being human, not just in the brain, but also the body. And the body is what allowed us, I think, to get out of Africa, allowed us to spread around the old world in an incredibly fast amount of time. And we have Homo erectus appearing in Africa maybe 1.75 million years ago. Almost coincidentally with that, we have what's now being called Homo erectus at the gateway of Asia in what's today the Republic of Georgia. Perhaps soon after that, we're in Java. So it's a remarkable migration of these early humans. And the idea of, I think, the larger brain, the larger body, those are the two keys that allowed us to populate the old world as we did. And I think we see a real, I see, maybe not a break, but I see a real distinction there between how Homo erectus and later hominids behaved and adapted to their environments, compared to what I see as a much more localized phenomenon of our earlier ancestors, Homo habilis, as well as the Australopithecines in Africa. So I could make that break, that distinction. I don't know if I want to say anything beyond that as far as behavioral differences, something that we could recognize more human-like versus ape-like.
And I think that's an interesting point that you're making, that there's a tendency to focus on the cognitive differences between humans and then other species, but for you, that the actual physical aspects of things like bipedal locomotion and the way that we're built is an integral part of that. So that's an interesting distinction that maybe a lot of times we're not used to talking about. From a primatological perspective, what would you say to that idea? Is there a point where you can say, this is an animal, but this is a human?
Well, I'm glad you put it that way, because, and Andy himself said we're not animals, or some people think we're not animals. Is there a point where we can say we're not animals, we're humans? I mean, the answer to that is absolutely not, because we are animals. The question is, what does it mean to be a human animal? Yes. And by the way, I want to make a comment scientifically, but first I have to make a theological comment. So I ended my talk with Blaise Pascal. He happens to be my favorite Christian thinker, and one of his pensées. He never wrote a book. He just had fragments of a book. But he says he doesn't go the direction you'd expect him to go on this. So many Christians worry that people are going to think we're only animals. Pascal says, man is neither angel nor a brute. And the unfortunate thing is, he who would act the angel acts the brute. And what he means by that is that there's probably graver moral risk to humanity in thinking too highly of ourselves than there is to recognizing that we share natures with animals. The biblical revolution goes farther. We're not just animals, we're dust. There's nothing special constitutionally. We're frail creatures. So I wouldn't want to say there's any point in which we say we're not animals. But I would want to ask, is there anything about us as animals that is special? I think there's lots of empirical evidence to at least fuel the conversation. But I guess I guess as a Christian I would want to say, and I also think in terms of current cognitive and evolutionary accounts of the role that conscience and morality plays in human sociality, I would want to say that although Homo erectus or Homo habilis may have had cognitive capacities in this direction, they're not here anymore. So I would want to ask, is it legitimate to think that other living organisms have a conscience to which they are morally responsible, a conscience that is capable of perceiving the reality of moral norms and responsibilities? And then I'd even want to ask the question, which is strictly a metaphysical question, not a scientific question. If there is a God who is the author of moral reality, do other creatures have a moral obligation to the Creator and have access to the Creator for forgiveness and moral empowerment? And that's not a question that can be answered empirically, but I think no. I don't think I blame my dog for for their behavior in moral terms, and I don't think my God has access to God. My dog has access to God. There's a little dyslexia right there for moral transformation.
Okay, another way of thinking about this is a lot of the conversations we've had about things like transfer of knowledge and culture really come down to a sense of self-awareness. Is that something that you can even tell scientifically in other animals besides humans? And if so, what are some areas of research that might be pointing towards or against that in other animals?
Well, that's a hot issue
Yeah.
in comparative ethology and cognitive science these days. And that's not my specialty, but it's an area that I'm interested in. And I'll just tell you, one of the big questions has to do with what's called theory of mind. That's not philosophy of mind. That's the human beings, everybody in this room has a theory of mind. That is to say, I am aware of the fact that I have a mind, and I'm ascribed to you a mind. And so I have thoughts about what you're thinking. In fact, human beings have recursive theory of mind. I have thoughts about what you might be thinking about my thoughts. And how many recursions do we get? So a big debate in primatology is whether other primates have theories of mind. And again, this is a completely secular question. There are people who line up on both sides of the question, and I would say empirically we don't know yet.
I'd agree. I think that there is work that's been done that suggests that other animals, in particular other primates, understand intentionality of other group mates and can intentionally deceive. I mean, you showed the work of Duval. Frans Duval has been a pioneer in these things. His wonderful book, Chimpanzee Politics, implies, of course, in fact explicitly states that these animals have the kinds of behaviors that we would ascribe to our own politicians. I'm not sure who that would, if that's a diss on the politicians or the chimps. I have my guesses, but so I think there's quite a lot of interesting research on this, and of course there are some empirical tests on self-awareness. The mirror test. There are only a handful of animals that can identify themselves in the mirror instead of recognizing that image as something else, and often will react badly to it.
Is that the one where you put something on their face and they look in the mirror and try to wipe
Exactly.
it off?
Put a red dot, red paint on their head.
And so the idea there is that an animal can look in the mirror and go, "Oh, I have something on my head." Realizes that what they're seeing is a reflection of theirs.
Most of course, dogs. They're always dogs with mirrors. It's a fun thing to do. But chimpanzees are a whole different ballgame.
Okay, so with that idea of theory of mind, with Neanderthal, you talked about an awareness of death, and particularly in decorating of graves, grave goods, putting flowers on graves. In what sense is that something that you see only in humans or in other hominids, or is that also something that you can see in animals outside of the primates?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's another excellent question. And as far as the elaborations and the complexities of what we're seeing in human burial, it's only approached in our ancestors as far as what we see among Neanderthals. I'm not even sure if I should talk about elephant graveyards, but there are other animals that do have an emotional reaction to the death of their offspring or a mate. And there are some very, very poignant scenes of mothers carrying around their dead infants for weeks after that baby has passed in amongst non-human primates. So we see, again, I think I come back to this point of this continuity. Maybe not the elaboration, certainly not the elaboration, certainly not the symbolism, the ritual that we see in beginnings with Neanderthals and, of course, with us. but the ability to perceive something similar. Maybe it's projection. I mean, I have to admit that that's a possibility, that I'm projecting onto animals this capability. But I think there's enough evidence that suggests that those, the latencies are there, the substrates, as Jeff had mentioned earlier, might be there. Now, whether or not those kinds of elaborations in us exceed what we might call this continuity, that there really is a reflection of a break, that's something that can be discussed and something that can be debated. And we might have different views on that.
Yeah, I don't think we do have different views in terms of some fundamental continuity, and I don't think we are projecting. The philosopher of biology, Hans Jonas, in response to the criticism that in making these kinds of comments we're anthropomorphizing, he says, no, we're not, we're zoomorphizing. That these are things that are shared broadly across the animal world. So, the attachment mechanisms that we're beginning to understand progressively more deeply, even at the molecular level in terms of the hormones that mediate sense of social attachment and parental attachment are increasingly well understood. They're broadly shared across mammals, and especially mammals who invest highly in a fewer number of offspring. So the stories that Andy just told, I mean, these aren't just apocryphal. The regard that elephants have not only for lifelong relationships, but for the bodies of those with whom they've been related, and even in certain cases, visiting the site where the loved one had died for many years after, suggests this really profound sense of enduring attachment and regard for the other. So I'm with you on that. Whether burials and regard for the body of a loved one also represent something more, for example, the cognitive attribution of an afterlife or something like that, we might not know, although we do know that in current human cultures these beliefs are quite common. And again, I would say the cognitive processes that enable us to construe of an afterlife are probably not discontinuous. But do other living organisms think that their that their deceased loved ones are alive someplace? It's hard to crawl into the brain of another primate, but I doubt it. And therefore, in thinking, their behavior might not be motivated, and their interpretation of life might not be motivated by those kinds of beliefs.
This might be a bit of a complicated question for the two of you, but one of the interesting things in putting your two perspectives together and to talk about the idea of human origins, human uniqueness, is that you both come from different fields within science. So the methodology used for anthropology gives very different and interesting answers that can then complement answers that you can get in, say, cognitive science or biology or evolutionary theory. So what I'd like to ask you is, in thinking about this question, are there ways in which your discipline has limitations on the way that it can approach and answer that question? And in what ways do you think your discipline can uniquely answer that question? Because, Andy, you come from you look at things from a historical record, while Jeff works a lot with genetics and evolution.
Well, I think we all have limitations in our approaches, and it's important as scientists to recognize those and to acknowledge them and try to deal with them in a forthright manner as best you can. All scientists are human, and as a result, we have these preconceived notions and biases built in. So we have to acknowledge them and try to deal with those as best we can. As far as what the major, I suppose, roadblocks, impediments to understanding in anthropology is what you just said, is I think in paleoanthropology, the study of human evolution, is that it's an historical science. And our data, by its very nature, is, well, compared to many other sciences, spotty. Though, in fact, we do have one of the better fossil records in comparison to many other large mammals that that is available. So in that regard, we do have a pretty good representation amongst our evidence. But it's still, nevertheless, stones and bones. And there is a limitation there as far as what we can interpret. And the idea of, yes, we have the data, but the interpretations are what can be controversial, what can be debated, and that's always the case in paleoanthropology in particular.
But what do you see are the really unique advantages to stones and bones? What
Well,
does it provide that?
It's the direct evidence of what's happened in the past. And the other types of data that we might get from living organisms are indirect. And yes, the pseudogenes that Jeff mentioned, of course, are very good indications of that shared ancestry. But as far as what we actually looked like and behaved like, the best evidence that we have until we invent a time machine are those stones and bones.
Well, gosh, your question illuminates why we're here. I hope that we all recognize, in addition to maybe having different background beliefs about metaphysics, all of our disciplines are constrained, and that's the very genius of a university. It's also part of what may subvert universities, because they can be insulated into departments. Andy and I were talking earlier, we both have some connection to the University of Michigan. There's a particular genius there where now we're seeing centers and institutes grow up in the university environment that focus on questions rather than disciplines. I really believe that's where we need to go in terms of the constraints of evolutionary theory on these issues. I think this is changing, but many of my colleagues would say that we developed a new toolkit in evolutionary biology in the 1970s or so, in which evolution's gone through the proposal of Darwin and then the synthesis with genetics. And then we got this new toolkit that reconceptualized fitness in terms of a property of genes. That opened up this idea of kin selection, that I could cooperate with others, invest in others, even if they weren't my offspring, if they shared my genes. We got some other tools. For many years, those theoretical tools have driven the conclusions of evolutionary theory ahead of the empirical evidence. I'm not saying in contrast to it, but we got a lot of proposals. Here's one of my favorites. So, if you just think logically that human behavior is informed by genes, and even if it isn't determined by genes, that the central tendencies or dispositions in human behavior are informed by genes, and it's informed by those genes that successfully get transmitted to the next generation, then you might think on logical grounds alone, behaviors which subvert my reproductive success for the sake of Andy's would be selected against. So you get a statement like this from David Barish. If natural selection is both sufficient and true, it is impossible for a genuinely disinterested or altruistic behavior pattern to evolve. So there's a strong statement about what's possible based on a certain theoretical construction. And now here we need to step outside and ask the empirical question. Well, do we have these behavior patterns? And by the way, I'd want to ask across the disciplines. I'd want to ask sociologists and social psychologists and other kinds of cognitive scientists to weigh in on these. So my hope, by the way, is that rather than, this is not so much to do with the human uniqueness question, but just who are human beings, to construct an understanding of who humans are, we wouldn't construct it to fit a particular theoretical understanding of evolutionary theory, which, by the way, has changed since the quote I just mentioned. But we constructed around stones and bones, and population genetics, and game theoretic models, and social psychology, and cognitive sciences. We get together to construct a notion of what human beings are, and then develop an evolutionary theory to account for how we got here.
And that anticipates kind of my final question before we break for individual groups, which is, even though the two of you very much disagree in conclusions, how essential to you has been different kinds of interdisciplinary work been for what you do in creating the pictures of evolutionary history that you work with?
Well, before we answer, do you think you and I, what was the word you used? Strongly disagree in conclusion? Do you think we do?
I don't think you strongly disagree,
Oh,
no.
okay. I'm not actually sure. I mean, I don't want to be waffly here.
Well,
I think.
all right. I
yeah.
think what was really intriguing about this entire evening for me was reading about where you come from and understanding that you accept a very straightforward, naturalistic explanation of the diversity of life on this planet. And if we want to get to any fundamental disagreement, while everybody is still sitting here and probably saying, when are they ever going to start disagreeing with one another, then maybe this is the time to do it. And the idea...
I got to go.
And I think what we can do, I mean, in this spirit of civil engagement, is yes, we both accept that we've gotten here through naturalistic processes, but that's sufficient for me. And I think that's where we have a parting of our ways. You have, I'm not going to ascribe what you have. You can describe for it yourself. But for me, again, I'll just talk about myself as an individual, not even as a scientist. I mean, as a scientist, I prescribe to the idea of methodological naturalism, in which one has to only invoke natural causation in any kinds of scientific explanations. Those are the only types of explanations that can be tested. Anything that invokes any supernatural cause, of course, removes itself from the realm of science. And so I do my science that way. I understand my science that way. And I'm honest with myself. It percolates into my personal life philosophy as well. But nevertheless, even if that wasn't the case, what I've come to understand about my worldview is that I don't require anything beyond what we have here in this world. And, you know, I don't have, I'm not an atheist, because an atheist believes there is no God. I don't know. I'm agnostic on the question. And in that context, you might also perceive me as not having faith, but I do. I have faith in the love of my family. And that's what gives me my purpose. That's what gives me what I think is my meaning in this life. And as I continue on in this personal bearing of my soul in front of all of you, I'll just finish by saying that I also get great comfort from the fact that this idea of dust to dust, which I think is really cool that you've mentioned this a couple of times, is exactly how I perceive what I consider to be a type of immortality that I will enjoy even after I die. And it doesn't have to do with the life after death. It doesn't have to do with the soul. But it has to do with the fact that we are made out of these constituent atoms that come from the center of exploded stars. And that the fact that we will continue in this, what used to be us will continue throughout the rest of time, as far as we understand it, and will be recycled, is a wonderful way of thinking about a kind of immortality in that regard. Now, as far as leaving any kind of a imprint upon this world, that's from whatever you did in this life. And however you made impacts upon people, the love of the family that's continued, the memories. So to me, I get great comfort from that, though I'll be honest with you, and I will say that I'm envious of Christians that believe that there is an afterlife, that there is a way of seeing our dear departed in another plane afterwards. I don't have that comfort, and so when I'm on my deathbed, I'm not sure how it's going to be, but I'll deal with that. And so I apologize for getting out in front of this with this, but there is a difference there, and so Jeff, by all means, I would love to hear your perspective on accommodating this naturalistic worldview as far as life on the planet, and a way of understanding our
I would say that that was rather beautifully put.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'm going to clap for that. So I want to avoid being too melodramatic here, but that really was beautifully put. And I've done this a number of times. I mean, this is the moment that I've always hoped for because, yeah, we are being candid about where we disagree, but actually it's not a vilifying kind of disagreement about the interpretation of either observable facts or inferred causal sequences that virtually all scientists think we should agree on. So first of all, parenthesis, you asked specifically, has there been benefit in collaborating with people with different points of view? And I want to respond to Andy's comment, but I need to say, first of all, for me, absolutely. And in fact, I'm in a project right now that involves evolutionary theories of religious cognition. That involves, well, first of all, population geneticists, an anthropologist who I'll recommend his work. His name's Rich Sosis from University of Connecticut. An evolutionary biologist named Dominic Johnson, who's an atheist from Oxford. Dom and I have a paper in press right now on these issues. I've learned so much by collaborating with people who not only have different disciplines, but who think that I'm just plain wrong in my metaphysical beliefs, but who don't hate me. You know, we actually like each other. So now, Andy he said that he believes in methodological naturalism, and the world that paints is enough, or something like that. So I guess I want to say yes and no to that, and it depends what enough is. So in terms of my quest to understand what the Greeks would call efficient causation, what are the causes that lie behind the regular and describable continuity of observable events? It is enough for me. Now, I want to be sensitive to some Christians in the audience for whom it might not be enough. It might be for you that that for your faith, it's important for you to see God as a not just an ultimate final cause, but as a direct intervening cause in natural events. I don't rule that out in principle, and as a Christian, I actually believe that's what happened with the resurrection. But that was a singularity, and we're not talking about that. Of course, Andy doesn't believe that happened. But when we're talking about the occurrence of regular events in the world, it's not a need for me, and I actually don't see evidence for it.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.